Hello and welcome to this how-to webinar of the RSB. We're going to talk today about the certification offered by RSB, and so the topics that we'll cover during this webinar will include the purpose of RSB certification, the processes for implementing and becoming certified, the different bodies who are involved in those processes, how to define your scope and select an appropriate certification for your operation or your supply chain, as well as some of the key requirements and costs associated with RSB certification. Hello and welcome to this how-to webinar of the RSB. In this webinar now we're going to learn all about the certification offered by the RSB. So we'll cover the benefits of certification, the processes for implementing and becoming certified, the different bodies involved in the process, how to define your scope and select the appropriate certification for your operation or supply chain, as well as some of the key requirements and costs that are involved in RSB certification. Certification is one of the solutions offered by the RSB to organisations who are committed to sustainability and the bioeconomy. Now, by definition, certification is a market tool. So it helps to give you market access, for example, to niche markets, to some regulated markets, in the case where sustainability is the key requirement for your consumer. In addition, it helps to reduce business risk, and we're talking not only about your own business, but also to your supply chain partners and your shareholders and your investors. In addition, RSB certification helps to provide NGO support, and it enables your brand to be linked to sustainable practices and have influence in the public domain. So in this webinar, we're going to guide you through the RSB certification process. We're going to look at the different stages and steps which form the certification process. We'll see who's involved at each step, what types of certification are available from the RSB, which will of course depend on the objectives and scope of your certification, and finally we'll talk about the costs involved. The first step in the RSB certification process is the application. Now, RSB offers an online application where businesses interested in RSB certification provide their general information. So, for example, information about the scope of supply chain, which is looking for certification, so really defining, for example, the types of feedstocks and final products of this supply chain, the location of the sites to be certified, and of course contact details. This application is followed by a 2-week public consultation period where RSB's members and stakeholders will be informed of this application, giving them the opportunity to provide any comments and information. RSB will evaluate any comments received, and if approved, the business will become an RSB participating operator. Step 2 is for participating operators to prepare for the audit. So for this, the RSB offer some pre-assessment tools online for risk assessment and risk screening. And these enable the participating operator to really identify the relevant requirements of the RSB standard, which are applicable for their supply chain scope, and to identify any gaps which are existing, which they would need to fill in order to meet RSB's requirements. And during this step, it also offers the opportunity for the participating operator to prepare all of the documentation which will be needed for auditors to check your compliance with the RSB standards. During this process, the participating operator should also contact a certification body to start to arrange the audit. And RSB has approved certification bodies, which we will talk about in a minute. Now, the next step is the actual audit. So the auditor, the third-party independent auditor, will visit your site to check for compliance with RSB's requirements that are applicable to your scope. And this involves a stakeholder consultation, a review of all of the documentation which has been gathered in step 2, interviews with staff, it could be field observations. And during this audit, if the auditor finds any non-compliances, then non-conformities are raised. So step 4 involves the closure of non-conformities. And you're given a time period over which you're able to meet the closure of these non-conformities. And once they are closed and all of the requirements have been met, then step 5 involves the RSB issuing a certification and the audit report being provided to RSB. Now, the RSB certificate will be valid for a period of 2, 3 or 5 years, depending on the risk class which has been identified for the operator. And during this certification period, so 2, 3 or 5 years, there will also be annual surveillance audits. So who's involved in the RSB certification process and what are their different roles? The participating operator is the organisation who applied for certification and who will implement the RSB standards in their operations. So this could be a farmer, it could be a cooperative of rapeseed producers, for example, it could be a biodiesel producer or trader, and so forth. The participating operator is then checked for compliance by the auditor, and importantly, RSB certification is carried out by independent auditors. Now, the auditor is a qualified professional who complies with the RSB procedures and requirements to carry out RSB audits, and the auditor works for a certification body which is responsible for conducting RSB assessments and preparing the audit reports. And as already mentioned, the certification body is an independent organisation. And the certification body is accredited. So the accreditation body is responsible for evaluating and monitoring the certification body to ensure that they carry out RSB audits and perform audit reports to a good standard. And finally, RSB is the standard setting body. So we construct the standards and we ensure that they meet the high level of certification that we require. But of course, we don't carry out the certification audits. That's an independent process. Any RSB certification needs to clearly define its scope. And of course, defining the scope will also define which RSB standards are applicable to you. Now, RSB is a multi-feedstock certification system, and therefore we're very flexible to include a wide range of types of operators and supply chains. So, to identify the scope of your certification, it's first important to define the types of products that you want to sell as RSB certified. So it could be a biofuel, an advanced fuel, an advanced product, a bioplastic, for example. Then you need to also think about the market that you're selling into. So for example, in Europe, the RSB standard is recognised by the European Commission to certify against the EU RED requirements. And finally, it's important to define the exact supply chain that it needs to be included within the certification scope. So we could be talking about a single site, a number of different sites, or an entire supply chain beginning at the feedstock producer all the way down to the delivery of a final product to its consumer. So the RSB actually offers a variety of different types of certification, and it's important to identify which one is relevant to you and to your supply chain. First of all, the RSB Global Certification, and this is for energy producers in any region globally. So, for example, if you wish to certify biomass to be used to produce fuels, or wish to certify an advanced fuels supply chain. Next, we have the RSB EU Red certification. Now, this is a certification recognised by the European Commission, and it's for the purpose of certifying operations which wish to trade in the regulated European market. So we're looking at biomass and fuel producers who may be located globally. However, the important factor here is that if you wish to trade within the European regulated market, then you need to seek this certification. So the RSB EU Red certification is recognised under the Renewable Energy Directive. So for example, if I'm an ethanol or biodiesel producer and I'm based in the USA, but I wish to sell within the European market, this is the certification I would go for. Next, we have the RSB's Advanced Products Standard, and this is the standard for non-energy products. So we talk about both bio-based products, products made from end-of-life products, and also production residues. And we've got a huge range of the types of products and their relative feedstocks which can be certified here. So, for example, bioplastics, cosmetics, textiles, pharmaceuticals, and these can be produced from a wide range of feedstocks. So, biomass, residues, waste gases, waste plastics. Next, we have the RSB Smallholder Standard, which is an addition to the RSB Global Standard. And the RSB Smallholder Standard is specifically for groups of smallholder farmers. So we're talking farmers with a total area of less than 75 hectares who wish to become certified according to the RSB Global Standard. And then finally, we have a voluntary addition, which is our low indirect land use change, so low ILUC module. And this is a voluntary addition to the RSB certification. And it's for those operators who seek to demonstrate that their supply chain has low risk of causing indirect land use change. So it's important to understand the scope of your RSB certification, which means to understand your supply chain and all of the operators and sites which you wish to include within your certification scope. And then once we understand the scope, we can see which are the standards applicable at each step. And within your certification scope, you may include the entire supply chain, or you may wish to focus just on part of the supply chain. So we can look at biomass producers or waste or residue collectors, because of course we certify using both types of feedstocks. Then we look at transport along the supply chain, storage and trading facilities. We look at processing, so industrial process facilities, all the way up to delivery to the final end user. And of course, for a product to carry RSB certification, all of the upstream steps within the supply chain must be covered by RSB certification. So this could mean that you cover the entire supply chain within your certification scope, or it might mean that, for example, as an industrial trader, your certification scope covers just that part of the supply chain, but that you're acquiring RSB certified feedstock into your supply chain. So RSB certification has really 3 key requirements, and these are set out in this table presented here to show you which of these 3 requirements are applicable for which types of operators. So our 3 requirements are, first of all, the sustainability requirements, which are set out in RSB's principles and criteria, greenhouse gas emissions, and traceability, also known as chain of custody. Now, starting at the beginning of the supplier chain, the biomass producer is required to comply with all 3 of these key requirements. So the sustainability requirements, the calculation of their greenhouse gas emissions, and then of course the traceability of the materials from the production location. Then looking at the next type of operator, we have point of origin operators. So we're talking about those who generate end of life or production residues. Now, the sustainability requirements of RSB certification are applicable for some types of point of origin operators and not for others. So to give you an example, for forestry harvesting residues, we do have certain sustainability requirements. Whereas for a product, for example, like used cooking oil, there are no sustainability requirements there. But greenhouse gas emissions are applicable here, and traceability is applicable for some types of production residues again. So for example, when we look at used cooking oil, we don't need to trace all the way back to its very origin, rather we trace from the collector or the aggregator of the material. So next, in terms of operators, we have the first collector or aggregator, so the end of life or production residues. Now, there are no sustainability requirements here. But perhaps it's important also to note how we define a first collector or aggregator. So these types of operators don't carry out any industrial operations. They might carry out a mechanical process such as, for example, filtering an oil, but that would be the limit of their operation in terms of defining them as a first collector or an aggregator. So no sustainability requirements here, but they do need to carry out a GHG emissions calculation for their operation, and they're part of the supply chain. And of course, it's important for them to be able to provide traceability documentation. Next, we have industrial operators. So here we're talking about where the manufacturing of processes take place. So sustainability requirements do apply here. So, for example, a biofuel producer, they would be in the situation of applying the RSB principles and criteria, then of course making the GHG emissions calculation, and then supplying the relevant traceability information. And finally, in the supply chain, the last operator we would have would be the transport or trader or distributor. And again, no sustainability requirements apply at that step, but GHG emissions must be calculated and the relevant traceability documentation should be provided. Understanding the costs of certification is one of the frequently asked questions that we get, so I hope this provides a good overview of how the costs are structured. And we could say that certification really can be split into direct and indirect costs for the operator. So looking at the direct costs, first of all we have the RSB application fee, which is currently $500, and this will be paid at the application stage when you apply online for certification. Next we have the annual licensing fee, which varies according to the type of operator becoming certified. So for biomass producers, the annual fee is based on the certified cultivated area. For industrial units, it's based on the amount of RSB products sold with RSB claims. And for traders and distributors, the annual fee is based on the number of sites or offices which are certified. And we do have a fee calculator which is available on the RSB website for you to use to carry out some calculations and scenarios to see what your costs might be. Then finally we have the external audit costs. So these are the costs which are charged to the operator by the certification bodies to carry out all of the audit work. So we're looking at certification, surveillance audits, and all of this work which is carried out during the validity of the RSB certificate. And as mentioned previously, RSB have registered certification bodies which we can provide you with information about. That information is available on our website, and you may contact them and ask for a quote to carry out the certification for you, to carry out the audit, and then choose the certification body that you wish to go with. These audit costs will be calculated by the certification body according to the time needed really for the scope of the audit, which of course the time needed will depend on the complexity of the audit, the location, the number of sites, the travel time that may be required for site visits and so forth. And these costs are paid directly to certification bodies and they don't come to RSB. And then finally, these were the direct costs that we've talked about. So for a participating operator, you also have indirect costs, which aren't mentioned here. And these are related to your internal efforts that are needed to achieve RSB certification, which are of course related to the stage of compliance you're currently at and the activities that you need to implement the standards. So of course, this is individual to each organisation and depends how far along in the process you already are towards achieving certification.